All right, now I'm really excited to announce Peter. Peter Hirshberg is the CEO of Reimagine Group, and he is an impresario in the Valley, and I always am happy when I see him at a couple of conferences on the circuit, if you will. But he has not been only with Apple before, so he's a legend deep down in the roots of the Silicon Valley, but he's also engaged as a chairman of GAFTA, which is the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. So he is, I think, a modern prototype, a Renaissance man of the Valley, and he just came back. He just organized last week a big conference with 400 mayors from the US and international mayors, a whole week of celebrations of where, well, the maker cities and creative art, people, technology, and the makers and the leaders come together. And I want to hear fresh insights from that. Peter, take the stage, please.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Great. Well, Harold, you just finished asking us to think about the future. What would the smart city look like in 2050? I thought it would be worth going backwards and having a booze, going back to what our cities looked like just 40 years ago. You know, the city was one of the great inventions of the last 2,000 years, but by about the 1970s, by 1974, we had pretty much given up on our cities. They were destined to urban renewal. They seemed like there had been flight from the cities. What was left in the cities were a lot of problems. No one was sure what to do. And we saw headlines like this: desperate battle for the future of our cities. And in many ways back then, the question was, this blight in our cities was like some ooze that we couldn't do better with. William White, who wrote The Exploding Metropolis in the 1950s, when the world was trying to figure out what to do with their cities, wrote, "Everyone, it would seem, is for the rebuilding of our cities with a unity of approach that is remarkable, but this is not the same as liking cities." He continued to say that most of the rebuilding underway and in prospect is being designed by people who don't like cities. They don't merely dislike the noise and the dirt and the congestions. They dislike the city's variety and concentration, its tension, and its hustle bustle. In many ways, the idea that we have today, cities as innovation labs, makers labs, where creative people go and innovation comes from, it was the opposite of that when I was growing up. That's a remarkable change in the last 50 years. This is from Bloomberg Philanthropy's recent report. Today, cities clearly compete on the basis of innovation. Cities know they compete for the most talented people. And all of this entrepreneurial activity is now spilling over from the pure entrepreneurial sector, where we're building startups and mobile apps and new server-based things, to working on the city itself as a platform. And you see all of this activity improving cities. Bloomberg, for example, recently held a contest. Contests and hackathons are the rage. And when I talked to Mayor Bloomberg about this, he pointed out to me that the best money he ever spent was getting cities to compete and work together and to share. As Harold mentioned, we just had a conference in San Francisco, two really, this week. There was the US Conference of Mayors. So it was a couple of hundred of mayors came to town to talk about mayor business. And then we threw a second one with our own mayor called the City Innovate Forum. And it was from people around the world who get up every day trying to solve problems of cities. And this is the interesting thing. With the rise of mobile software and mobile data, it doesn't take a public agency to go solve a problem. It takes an Uber that knows where people are and could put together a matching algorithm to build a transportation service. In fact, in San Francisco, we're fond of saying we've had more evolution of the transit industry in the last 3 years than in the last 30. And when we had this conference with mayors from around the world, the number one topic was, what do we do about the sharing economy? How do we regulate things like Airbnb and Uber? Because essentially, the private sector is innovating faster than the government knows what to do with it, and there's this intense interest. I kidded with our mayor, there's no mayor in the world who gets up every day and gets more help from artists and designers and urbanists and software people and burners from Burning Man than our mayor. Help that often he may not look for, but it's that work that's at work on the city. And if you were to go back, I'm sure that someone like Robert Moses, the great master builder himself, would not have been happy about all this. He would not have known what to do with all of this amazing bottom-up innovation, which is the heart of what we're doing today. But more than that, this is really pretty different than the smart city vision of even 5 years ago that an IBM or a Cisco had. Because 5 years ago, the idea of a smart city was mechanistic and sensors and the kind of images that Harold's shown. We kind of imagined that a smart city would basically adapt a whole bunch of technology and make us more efficient. The thing we've clearly figured out is that the rules of open innovation deeply apply to a city. The same rules that allowed Wikipedia to happen and that crowd making the Wikipedia smarter is actually happening in the physical space of the city. And that was kind of unexpected. We don't really have a term for this. So a term we've started using is the maker city. We've been using this for about a year and a half. I think the Institute for the Future came up with it about 18 months ago, and then Dale Doherty, who runs Make Magazine and throws the Maker Fair, came up with it. How many of you have been to a Maker Fair? Maker Fair is a completely amazing gathering of people that are using everything from Arduino and sewing and robots, and essentially just the act of creating stuff. It completely captivated the President of the United States, because if you're in Washington, you realize what you need is manufacturing to come back. And you're going to get manufacturing to come back not by bringing dumb jobs back, but by training people in all of these exciting new technologies where hardware meets software, the technologies of making. And if you kind of have people grow up that way, and if you start doing local manufacturing in cities, and this is the interesting connection. Today we have a global supply chain and stuff comes from China, much of it coming into a port like this, and then we consume stuff. But as technology has much more software put into the manufacturing side of things and you can do local production, you start to see changes. That's why the President said our parents and grandparents made the greatest economy on earth, not by buying stuff, but by making stuff, and hence the focus on it. So a year ago, there was a White House Makers Fair, and we put a big initiative behind bringing manufacturing back to cities, and also the sense of engagement in cities. Here's how that kicked off.
Peggy, good evening. The president is focusing on manufacturing, and he used this Pittsburgh location to demonstrate how he wants the government to help entrepreneurs and startups to create new products and new jobs.
We make smartphone cases that aim to prevent sexual assault.
Jayon Wang and his company LifeShell created their product using tools in space here at Tech Shop.
All of our teams come here to do a lot of our fabrication and prototyping.
President Obama used this small group at Bakery Square to illustrate his plan to allow inventors and business startups access to equipment like 3D printers with the idea of spurring manufacturing.
Nobody has done a better job or is a better example of this new trend than what's being done here at Tech Shop.
Obama today announced commitments from 90 mayors and community leaders, including Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto, to open up more spaces like this nationwide.
What we now have is, through technology, the ability to democratize the entire movement, to give everyone the tools that has a dream and an idea, the ability to start a company.
The White House says their plan includes opening access to $5 billion worth of advanced equipment in more than 700 research facilities nationwide.
Whether it's 3D printers or laser cutters that allow them to design their own ideas, create prototypes, put them out to market, test them, tinker with them, refine them, and ultimately create brand new businesses.
So at the White House last year, we asked American cities to come together as maker cities. And so far, over 100 have joined that network, but it's really a global phenomenon. This is an output of a 3D printing network, a company that's based here in Europe. You submit your designs and you go pick them up at a local store, and what you see is the locations where that exists. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the contour of what a new hyper-local manufacturing economy looks like. One that is still not in deep resolution, but we're at work at. When you talk about a maker city, one thing that strikes me about it is this is very new. We're combining new materials, new ideas, people. It's very much like jazz because there's so much new stuff to work with. And there's an interesting comparison here because just as jazz exploded on the scene in the 1920s, this was at the time when our cities were last hugely ascendant. It was the second industrial revolution. You had African Americans streaming up from the South, kind of coming into our factories. Eastern Europeans headed to Times Square. And jazz was really that contention of the individual and the group, improvisation, creativity. Those sets of values that kind of made cities great once again are at work yet again today. In jazz, you sometimes have to sacrifice the solo routine for the composition. That's called a community getting things great. There's a remarkable similarity there, and that's kind of where we're at today. You also see this in how teaching is done today. I went out to New York Polytechnic to visit how Luc Dubois is working with his students there. And he told me that in his media program, and Luc is an engineer but also a musician, he said everything here is an and. It's engineering and soft circuits, fashion and sensors, art and advanced manufacturing. And you start to realize that both education is changing and we're moving to a much more interdisciplinary world than kind of the top-down factory world that we had. You see this also in the urban form. What a factory or an innovation space looks like in a city is changing. New York City almost lost the fashion business because people were making stuff abroad. And so they created Fashion New York. This is a 100,000 square foot spot. It's part media lab because research is being done on soft circuits and future fibers and what embedded circuitry looks like. It's part incubator because companies are started there. And it's part manufacturing. So it's a little bit of kind of all of those things brought together in Brooklyn, where there's at once creativity, and also intergenerationally, where young students today can talk to kind of master tailors and fashion people who we would have lost and no one would have talked to. Another thing you see is that former industrial space is being reclaimed. Frequently space on the harbor, where we are today in Hamburg, here's a harbor space that is being turned into a very sophisticated new arena. Same thing happened in New York.
New York City has been working to redevelop the Brooklyn Navy Yard, bring it back to life, recreate it as a home for good-paying industrial jobs.
What I have seen in the last 10 years is just mind-boggling. A lot of local, state, and federal dollars have been poured into the Navy Yard's infrastructure to make it what it looks like today.
What you have is manufacturing the traditional sense of making things, but it's being combined with high-end design, with new technology, with art, woodworking, metalworking.
Currently, the Navy Yard has 275 businesses, and we've created about 6,400 jobs.
We're doing a project called the New Lab. We're creating spaces which will be shared by a whole series of innovative companies based around rapid prototyping, new manufacturing, and 3D printing. We're hoping just to become a catalyst that'll spawn a whole slew of different types of economic innovation.
Living in the neighborhood and seeing the Navy Yard coming alive and having job opportunities, I'm just excited.
For the city, these kinds of jobs are critical to creating stable middle-class communities.
Brooklyn is the place to be right now. It's coming up, it's coming up.
You know, in the 20th century, when it came to manufacturing, the supply chain was very spread out. Products might be designed in California, parts came from Shenzhen, other assemblies from other parts of the world. One of the great things about a city is it is this cauldron of innovation where so much stuff can happen locally, and that jazz between designer and manufacturer can take place. And you see various examples of this. In San Francisco, we have something called SF Made. It is essentially a celebration of locally made products, but also regulations that allow manufacturing to come back to the city. And now in the US, the Urban Manufacturing Alliance that's designed to celebrate this. When we talk about a maker city, and it really has two components. There's the civic engagement part, I get to work and build my city, open data and participation, and this manufacturing part. When we talk about the manufacturing part, it scales all the way up from very small, kind of more maker and artisanal products, all the way up to very advanced manufacturing, as current as the most recent software. I visited Nick Pinkston, one of the smartest AI guys I know, who's building one of the most smart factories I've seen.
Hi, I'm Nick Pinkston. I'm the founder of Plethora. Essentially, we're building a new kind of factory that makes this you can go from a design to a part very quickly. So like we're talking same day manufacturing here.
We actually have to be as close to our customers as possible because our customers want speed more than anything else. So essentially, we are blocks for many of our customers. They can just walk over here and pick up their parts. If they're waiting weeks for things to come overseas or come from other shops, they're behind. So the future is more and more and more speed. So the faster you can develop, the faster you can go and the more competitive you are. So you have the manufacturing in cities where all the design people are, where all of your customers are to make it work. I think we're going to see, sort of a rich sort of, ecology occur in cities that really, it used to exist here a long time ago, but we're actually seeing a new kind of form of it emerging. So you're having suppliers from the very high end, multinational companies are coming back and wanting to be in market, all the way down to like guys in their garage working on something. Like this entire thing from components and short-run production and prototypers and mass manufacturers, all of this is now coming back to cities because we have to be more reactive. We have to actually build things here because we have to innovate directly in market to do that.
Here's kind of a sobering thing about jobs. That factory is very smart. If you design a product on a CAD program, it understands how you're designing it, and it lets you design it in a way that when you send it over to his machine, no worker is needed to set the machine up. A lot of work generally is done to set up a machine, to set it up for the right tolerances, to machine something properly. All that's eliminated because smarts in the software basically understands all of those routines, and as long as you design it to follow that routine, you submit a design, the machine sets itself up and spits out a part. Analogy would be when I was at Apple and we invented desktop publishing, there used to be a business called pre-press, where you went from the design and then you laid out the press and you got the colors right. That's all eliminated. It's just you click a button. Same is happening here. You remember the Brooklyn Navy Yard? At its height in 1947, it employed about 60,000 people. Today it is fully rented, a very successful urban space, and it employs about 6,000 people. That's about a 10-to-1 ratio, which means the big open question in all of this is we're going to have to be inventing new forms of employment or re-questioning what the word work means. We know it'll favor people who are creative, are entrepreneurial, are creating things. Can we make enough kind of middle-class jobs to replace what's going away is the great open question of the day. It is the reason that maker spaces like these that show up in libraries and in schools and in community centers are so important. It's kind of how we retrain things. In Baltimore, the Digital Harbor Project has something called From Rec to Tech. They take former recreation centers, turn them into tech education. Libraries across the nation are beginning to do the same thing. There's a full hands-on deck effort to run these experiments. And we call them experiments because who knows how it's going to turn out. This is one of those things you can't predict about the economy. You have to go figure out how it works. It is interesting that we in the tech industry always think we invent things new. We came up with the Maker Faire, we came up with all those making stuff. Why would it be then in 1921 there was an America's Making Exposition in New York? How did those people on the fast eclipse us? Well, it turns out that for the same reason as today, making adds a lot of community value, social capital. When people are working together and collaborating, they actually get along together. That's what you have to do in cities. And it turns out 100 years ago in our cities, that was the problem when people from many different backgrounds streamed in. So at the Americans Making Exposition 100 years ago, it's, look, Americans of Italian lineage, they're making statues. Look, Americans of Yugoslavian lineage, they're using their saws and whatever. And there's about 60 pages of this, but its basic point was to inspire us that in our cities, in these great melting pots with all of these different skills, out of that you got greatness. Same issue as back then. Another thing about maker cities is they're all telling kind of a unique story. In a way, it's healthier than the tech business. In the tech business, every city in the world wanted to be like Silicon Valley, as you may have noticed. Everyone wanted to have the Silicon Valley. And really, how many cities have a 50-year-old tech tradition? How many cities, like, they get up in the morning and what they know about is building mobile apps? And yet, in cities like Pittsburgh, there's a long tradition in steel and manufacturing and working with your hands, and that has been transformed. Now it's one of the smartest cities in working with robotics and with manufacturing, with Carnegie Mellon University. And they've learned how to bring that out to many parts of it. So in this rural part of Pennsylvania, the school district has come up with a mechanism where kids who are as young as 6 are learning these techniques. In fact, the 12-year-olds are building projects for the 6-year-olds. This is a new form of kind of integrated education that you're seeing everywhere, and it begins to point to where we're going.
The Dream Factory is a combination of 3 classes that were previously separated: the art room, the tech ed room, and computers.
All 3 teachers collaborate
and bring together art and engineering.
When it's hands-on learning, it's something that you want to do.
What we need are measurements. When you have a board, take a look at your board.
I think it adds to our traditional wood shop, metal shop.
Students are programming interactive games, building robots.
The
Do they want to do 3D printing? Do they want to do painting? Do they want to do sculpture?
This is not a gifted program. It's not an after-school activity. Every kid is getting this in our school.
Now, what's amazing about this school is that in addition to kids learning all that stuff, I love the fact that the first graders do a painting. They make something, and then they go to the 8th graders, and they say, can you make this real? And the 8th graders might be using Arduino or vinyl cutters, or they'll write software. But the point is, there's this project-based notion that really takes kids seriously, lets them realize their dreams, teaches you can make stuff. It's kind of the software meets hardware. It's a really important part of education. And you see some extraordinary things. For example, here is the New View School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this 14-year-old girl is pitching the fact that she has been building a new prosthetic device that will enable people who have injuries or carpal tunnel, it will enable them to write. So you give these powerful tools to young people, and actually they're able to produce real things. This is a book by Stefano Miceli that talks about this. It's in Italy. He's asking, can we turn the artisanal business of trade into scalable? There's another point about the Maker City. It conveys a great sense of agency, in the sense that you think you can get something done. Here's one of my favorite examples of this. This is from Dallas. Jason Roberts lived in Dallas, Texas, and he noticed that in Dallas, Texas, they had only, there was no public transportation. They actually had the tracks from the former tram, but they'd been taken out because it was an American city. Then he came over here to Europe and he saw all of the light rail and the trams, and he went back and he said, we ought to have this in our city. So he created the Oak Cliff Transit Authority. He said, we ought to have light rail. And the government said, please, we're the authority, and you're in the suburbs. This is America. You don't get trains. We have highways. And so then his Oak Cliff Transit Authority wrote a plan and submitted it to the government, said, here's where we think the train should go, and we've done some research, and it'll be better this way. And the government went like this, said, please no. Well, then the Dallas government lost a federal grant, so he got the money, the $30 million, and his transit system's being built. The point is, you live at a time of empowered individuals, so if you actually have an idea for a city, you can go execute it. I got so excited about this, I decided in San Francisco we should all get badges and become commissioners of the San Francisco Urban Prototyping Authority. Because you see, we could all be commissioners, we could go build what we want, which is just a small exaggeration, because we actually threw a project in San Francisco called Urban Prototyping, in which we took a part of town and a developer who's trying to figure out what to do. We had hundreds of people work on it. They built examples and art projects. Here was you hold on to that heart and it turns it into music. Mayor Menino in Boston bought many of them. That became so sophisticated that when San Francisco this year is actually planning on redesigning Market Street. We've got a 2-mile main drag. It's going to be torn up, made more pedestrian friendly. It was turned into 5 parts of Market Street, each with a team captain, one of our big companies like Autodesk or a nonprofit like the Exploratorium. And we invited citizens and designers and architects to come up, imagine what that Market Street would look like. Because what we realized was, top down, we could not come up with an engaged city. We had to open it up.
We're looking for a process to actually bring that out into our public realm, and we thought our most important civic space, Market Street, would be a great place to start. How do you actually give that sense of individual agency to the community and to the residents of San Francisco?
It's not traditional public art. It's not commissioned, juried, incubated deeply. It's not thought of in a permanent or even semi-permanent way. Prototyping is something different. It's process in public space, it's experimentation. And the prototypes that we've selected, I consider all of them to be artistic. And what I'm after there is an expanded definition of what art is.
Interesting is all of this design work.
More people think of themselves as artists, and where artists are less marginalized and much more a part of the ongoing conversation and the ongoing fabric of their city.
This has convinced us that the way we should design the street is more like a Lego, as in, ideas may change, you do experiments. When we ran this project, all sorts of things went wrong in the first 24 hours, and they were kind of corrected. And we learned a lot. There was a climbing wall, and a 6-year-old brought his brother along and said, "Excuse me, my brother can't fit in the climbing wall. There isn't a low enough rung." And someone put one in there, and everything got smarter and it got adapted. This is kind of a new way of approaching planning. I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit. What's clear is our cities are becoming labs, and they're becoming labs, not just smart city labs that are done top-down so that IBM or Siemens can deploy their stuff. It actually is inclusive of all of us. And one of the questions is, how do you paint a vision for what a city looks like that's built by all of us? It's clearly not a corporate vision, it's an inclusive vision. One of the problems we have these days is we don't paint that many visions. When I was growing up as a kid, you know, Walt Disney would come and tell you about the future and about space. Or GE and GM would go to the World's Fair and tell you about the future. Today, innovation comes from all of us. So who's telling that story? I kind of looked back and realized, actually, Walt Disney's still the best storyteller of all, even better than Steve Jobs. And I was wondering, if Walt Disney was pitching us a city, what would he tell us to do?
Epcot will take its cue from the new ideas and new technologies that are now emerging from the creative centers of American industry. It will be a community of tomorrow that will never be completed, but will always be introducing and testing and demonstrating new materials and new systems. And Epcot will always be a showcase to the world for the ingenuity and imagination of American free enterprise. I don't believe there's a challenge anywhere in the world that's more important to people everywhere than finding solutions to the problems of our cities.
1967, when he was building Epcot, originally the Environmental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, Walt envisioned a learning city. If you'd taken out of his speech, it will be built by American free enterprise and industry, and stuck into that, it will be crowdsourced and built by all of us, you've gotten close to what we have today. So what is that great maker city today, that prototype? The thing that is not street legal, that is a prototype of what we might learn from and bring home. It turns out there is one. Some of us have been there, and all I can say is don't do this at your home every day. Well, that was an august start to a video. We'll try it one more time, and if not, I'll simply tell you about it.
The place is an idea that's so powerful and so alluring that people will go to the worst place in the world just to get a little taste of it.
So one of the great things about Burning Man as an example of a city is when you have 70,000 people who are at once creating it and it regulates itself, you have a really interesting dynamic, not unlike that original dynamic I talked about in jazz. I worked on a book on this last year with MIT Media Lab that kind of looks at how does that work, and you can download the book. It's, there you go. You can download it for free. Burning Man has 10 principles. 4 are about the individual, about self-expression. 4 are about the community. 2 are about medium and exchange. Jazz, about the individual and about the community, about the solo and the creative performance. Even in America, as we're struggling through this, the American idea is about rugged individuals and coming together as a community. So cities are about working these great tensions out. I'll wrap up with one more quick video because we're out of time. At its best, when people co-create with the city, they exceed themselves, they do something soulful, they surprise themselves, and they include others because it's some combination of art and technology and just an appreciation of the urban form. One of those things happened in San Francisco last year, the result of a couple of Burning Man people with a dream and one very large bridge.
We're all moths, you know, we all get this attraction to light. We move into this space of reflectiveness.
What could turn out to be one of the most flamboyant and expensive works of public art in Bay Area history appears to be close to reality.
When you stand next to the bridge, it's like being next to the Grand Canyon.
If the Bay Bridge was your canvas, what would you do on it?
You just move into a space of awe and terror, and we all suddenly sit there transfixed just by the magnitude of this piece.
Leo Villarreal is the light sculpture artist with the grand idea.
No one's ever done this before. This is something very unique. You know, you look down one side and it's 525 feet to the water. The other side is 250 feet to traffic.
Leo's interpretation of our discussions vastly exceeded anything I could have dreamed of. The impossibility is the thing that makes it possible. The impossibility is what inspires people to act around it.
With this entire project, there's certainly no guarantees. It's very complicated, it's very large scale.
People want to see it happen, and it shouldn't happen. These things they're not supposed to happen. The system is designed to say no.
You have to try. That's what I've learned, is that you just have to go for it.
You know, I went out looking for the Maker City, and what I found was really kind of that sparkling dream and hope in all of us. Cities as a lab is a place where we express ourselves. Cities with these empowering new technologies are the hopes for our future and the hopes for manufacturing. They clearly have always been laboratories of democracy, and now that we have more participatory tools, we can and must make them much more engaging. And it's a very exciting moment. The city has clearly become something for all of us. The tools for all of us exist. And that's why conversations like this are so important, because this is really a movement. That stuff I talked about with the White House before, where we got 100 cities sign up, and now we have kind of a Maker City organization, and now there's projects going on across America on figuring out how do you in fact put in place the kind of classroom training and the STEM programs, and how do you do the open government, open data things, or even crazy projects like the Bridge Project. This is all part of a movement where our cities get great because of us, and this is a movement that's just a few years old. So thank you for the opportunity to share it with you, and back to you, Harold. Thank you. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you.